Hey guys, welcome back to Mo's Game Table. Today we're going to take a look inside Enemy Action Kharkov. This is a game designed by John Butterfield and published by Compass Games. This is the long-awaited sequel to Enemy Action Ardennes, which is very popular and is going through a reprint again right now to match Enemy Action Kharkov's release. The game is now currently on Kickstarter, and that means the game is done. For those of you who are not familiar with Compass, what they do is they do a last pass by putting the game up on Kickstarter to see if there are some people who are not familiar with Compass games. They can check out the game and pick up a copy. But as you can see, the game is done. It's on my table, and we're going to take a look inside today. This is a fantastic deal. You get 3 games in one box: the Soviet solitaire system, the German solitaire system, and then the 2-player. So let's take a look at the back of the box and see what this game is all about. World War II Russian front, early 1943. 2 Soviet fronts launched Operation Star and Gallop against the German armies still reeling from their defeat at Stalingrad. The offensives capture the city of Kharkov and threaten a complete breakthrough until smashed by the German counterattack known as von Manstein's backhand blow. Enemy Action Kharkov, the second game in John Butterfield's acclaimed Enemy Action series, features 2-player competition with low complexity and constant decision points, solitaire play of both sides with enemy AI and fog of war, card-driven impulse system to activate formations, implement command events, or gain tactical advantages in combat. Chit draw combat system builds a narrative for each attack. Rules specific to Enemy Action Kharkov cover Soviet partisans, NKVD operations, offensive command quality, withdrawal under fire, armor depletion, von Manstein's Rohad, Soviet forward support, spring thaw, and mud. And there's an example of the map, the cards, and then the counters at the bottom. For the game components, we get 3 22 by 34 inch maps, 3 rulebooks, 432 counters, 110 playing cards, multiple player aids, and 1 10-sided die. It is rated as medium complexity. Time scale is 1 turn equals 3 days. Map scale is 7.5 miles a hex. Unit scale is regiments, brigades, and divisions. It is for 1 to 2 players. Solitaire suitability is obviously very high, 10 out of 10. And the average time to play is intro scenario 1 hour, full campaign 12 hours. Recommended age is 14 and up. So let's take a look inside and see what we get. All right, we get our Compass catalog. Always good to have one of those if you don't already have one. Our D10. Soviet command cards, German command cards, some replacement cards for Enemy Action Ardennes, bunch of baggies, the rule books for all 3 games in the box, player aids, there's a bunch, the counter sheets, which are pre-rounded and look fantastic, and our maps. So let's set up the maps and take a closer look at the game. And we'll take a look at the maps that come with the game. First up is the Soviet solo map, as it's labeled here at the top. You're going to be seeing the same area of ground used, just the perspectives will change. Here, you're going to see Kramatorsk and Slavyansk down here at the southern portion of the map. For the Germans, it'll be flipped and it'll be up at the northern segment of the map. Each map is going to be different based on how the AI is handled as well. That's why you've got 2 separate rulebooks for each of the AI systems for the solitaire. These little yellow squares here, this is going to be the German positions, and then you see these black triangles. Those are the German forward movement. And this is going to dictate to you which direction the German units will advance when it comes to movement, as well as advance after combat, things like that. You also have victory point locations sprinkled throughout the map, and then we have multiple types of terrain: clear, broken, woods, marsh. We've got towns and cities, roads, minor rivers. Then we also have the Donets and the Dnieper River. So you've got a wide assortment of terrain here to fight over, so it should be real interesting. At the top, we have reserve units and eliminated units for the Germans. At the bottom, we have the action deck and the German command deck, as well as the German action discards and the German command discards. Then we have the Soviet victory points, the reserve units, and the eliminated units. At the top, we have the terrain effects chart, which is going to give you an illustrated example of the different types of terrain, the type of terrain it is, the movement cost for infantry and cav as well as mech, and then other effects that the terrain will have during the game. Next, we'll take a look at the German solo map, and similar to what we saw with the Soviet solo map, although there are differences. We're going to have the same tech, we're going to have the game turn calendar, we're going to have draw pile and discards, as well as the Soviet command cards and the auxiliary card boxes down at the bottom right, reserve and eliminated units boxes for the Germans, and then reserve and eliminated units boxes for the Soviets at the top. The rest of the map is going to be the same, just flipped, but you're going to have different symbology on it. Remember, we had the German forward arrows, which were the black triangles. We're going to have those as well as these little hash marks. The black triangles are going to be the primary advancement arrow for the Soviets, and then the secondary is going to be that hash mark. Then we also have the different fronts. The Voronezh front is going to be the yellow, and then the southwest front is going to be the orange. So that's going to depict which areas that each of these different fronts will be in. Then we have these supply hexes, the logistics hexes. We've got the yellow, and then we've got the red ones there. So that's going to be the changes for the German solitaire map. And lastly, we have the two-player map, which is going to look like your standard hex and counter war game map. No extra symbols or anything. You're going to have your victory locations in there. They're going to be marked throughout the map. You're going to have your terrain, but you're not going to have any of the movement arrows because there's no need for it. There's no AI that you're going to be operating. It's going to be head-to-head for two players. Soviet player will be on one side, and the German player will be on the opposite side. All the same boxes that we've seen before on the other maps are going to be on this map as well. So that's why the recommendation is to start with the two-player game, get a feel for the system, get a feel for the area that you'll be fighting in. Then you can step up to the solitaire game because you're going to be then dealing with AI movement and all the issues with that as far as understanding and grokking how the AI works, as well as you playing the game against the AI. So that's why the two-player game is the way to start, and then you could advance on up to the solitaire game. But overall, three very beautiful maps. Once again, Compass knocks it out of the park. We start off here with the two-player fold-out. This is going to give you combat tactics and events. Start off on the left-hand side, all the combat tactics. Then we have the command events, and then the special events on the front page. On the inside, we have the key rule summaries, giving you information for tracing supply, effects of unsupply, Soviet support, tactical reserve deployment, strategic reserve deployment, dispersed units, applying replacement steps, and withdrawal. On the right-hand side, we have combat procedures. We get the combat sequence, drawing combat chits, combat chit summary, combat hits, step losses and retreats, and then advance after combat. And on the back of the fold-out, we have the terrain effects chart, strategic movement, stacking limits, German map edge movement, and light mud effects. And just like the two-player game, we have fold-outs for both the German and the Soviet solo games. This is for the German solo game. We have German combat tactics and Soviet combat tactics on the front. On the inside, we have the combat procedures, both parts 1 and 2. Breakdown of the Soviet attack, German attack, drawing combat chits, combat chit summary, combat hits and step losses, and retreats and advances. Similar to what we saw in the two-player game, it's just laid out slightly differently to accommodate the solitaire rules. And we finish out on the back with German command events, German special events, Soviet command events, and Soviet special events. And on the second fold-out for the German solo game, we have the key rule summaries on the front, tracing supply, effects of unsupply, dispersed units, German standard reserve deployment, German strategic reserve deployment, applying replacements, and placing Soviet garrisons. On the inside, we have the Soviet activation steps for step 1 and 2, the check active units front objective marker, move active units, restrictions to Soviet moves, tiebreakers, preferences moving adjacent to enemy units, methods for units with army objectives, and methods for unsupplied units. And this finishes out on the back with the Soviet activation steps 3 through 7. Conduct attack checks and attacks, place active reserve units on the map, remove active units to reserve box, place IP on one Soviet supplied unit, remove dispersed markers from active units, Soviet support, and Soviet operational limit. And for the Soviet solo game, we have similar foldouts. This one here gives the German combat tactics and events, you have German combat tactics, as well as the German command events. And on the inside, we have the combat procedures, parts 1 and 2. And you'll note these are very similar to what we saw with the German solo option, as well as the 2-player solo option. And on the back of the foldout, we have the Soviet combat tactics and events. And on the second foldout for the Soviet solo, we get the reserves, replacements, and garrisons. This gives steps for the German reserve deployment, Soviet tactical reserve deployment, Soviet strategic reserve deployment, assigning replacement steps, and the German garrison markers. On the inside, we have the German activations, parts 1 and 2, your action steps, units behind Soviet lines, German movement restrictions, German action terms, checking action card, and the conducting action card action with units. And we finish on the back of the foldout with the supply, Soviet support and withdrawal. You have tracing supply, effects of unsupply, Soviet support, and Soviet withdrawal steps. And on the final 2 player aid cards, we have the German and Soviet command card displays for both of these solo games. Next, we'll take a look at a few examples of the cards that are in the game. At the top, we have the Soviet player command cards. In the middle, we have the German player command cards. And at the bottom, we have the Soviet enemy command and the German action card on the right-hand side. Each of these cards is going to have a similar breakdown. In the top middle, we have the higher echelon that these units are subordinate to. The top left, we have the command value. Then we have the command section and the tactics section at the bottom. That's going to give you information as to what you can do with this card and with those units in your turn. Then you get further options with the German action cards and the Soviet enemy command cards at the bottom. Next, we'll take a look at the counters that come with the game. These are beautifully done counters. Nice, thick, and pre-rounded, so no worries about having to punch them out and clip them. They're going to be ready to go when you punch them out. At the top, we have the Voronezh front for the Soviets. Beneath that, we have the Southwest front. At the bottom, we have the 1st Panzer Army for the Germans. And next to that, we have the Army Detachment Kempf. On the next sheet, we finish out with the rest of Army Detachment Kempf. And then beneath that, we have the 4th Panzer Army. The rest of the counters here are combat chits as well as some administrative counters. On the next sheet, we have more administrative counters. And on the last sheet, we have the remainder of the administrative counters, as well as the unit chits and the Soviet combat chits. Next, we'll take a look at the rules. First up is the 2-player rules. This is a 28-page full-color rulebook. Inside of the front cover, we have the table of contents listing out all the rules and the associated page numbers. Then we get into the introduction, the game components, how to read all the components in the game, the cards, the counters, the maps, everything we've already looked at, broken down for you so it's easy to understand and follow along with. And then we get to setting up for play on page 7. Then a breakdown of the sequence of play, the different phases, the supply phase, command phase, Soviet impulse, German impulse, repeat impulses, end of game turn phase, and then we get to the draw pile in hand. We have an example of the enemy activation because we've got activation commands over here and how to play cards from your hand. Deploy reserves, event and special event commands, replacement commands, and then activating formations. Then we have an illustrated example of a camp group activation. We get into movement, and then we have an example of Zoc effects on movement, illustrated example there. Another one here for movement and strategic movement. So a lot of illustrated examples sprinkled throughout the rules. Crossing river hex side, stacking units, strategic movement bonus. Then we get into the zones of control, withdrawal, combat starts here on page 14, and it gives you all the steps for conducting combat. Attack eligibility, you have an illustrated example for attack eligibility. Same over here for the combat chit draw. Then we have another illustrated example. This one's going to be for flank attacks, replenishing the combat chit cup, combat hits, and then examples of the combat hits in the top right. Then we have step losses and elimination, elimination and destruction, assign step loss evenly. Then we get to retreats, illustrated example of retreats, and illustrated example of advance after combat. Then we get into supply with an illustrated example there. Another illustrated for tracing your supply. Then we have the different types of supply you got in the game. Your tracing, effects of unsupply, out of supply, isolated, surrender, air resupply, Soviet support, determining your support, Soviet forward support markers and the forward support marker removal. Then we have reserves, deploying your reserves, multi-unit deployments, an illustrated example here of the reserve deployment phase. And then we have the town, cities, and improved positions. We get to replacements. Then we have our victory conditions, and then the scenarios here on page 24. We've got 3 different scenarios. First one is the initial assault. Second is Operation Star and Gallop. And then lastly, we have the campaign game. And we have key changes from Enemy Action Ardennes. For those who are returning to the system after playing EA Ardennes, you'll be able to see what the quick rundown is for the changes between the 2 systems. Then we have design notes from John Butterfield. Then we finish out with the sequence of play summary on the back of the rulebook. Now we'll take a look at the German solo rules. This is a 52-page full-color book. Inside of the front cover, we have the table of contents listing out all the rules and the associated page numbers. And we get into the introduction, breaking down all the components and explaining them to you, just like we saw with the 2-player rules. And then it's going to have a very similar layout, but there's going to obviously be differences because now you're learning how to operate the AI for the game. And this explains the movement arrows. And then you have the different units for the Soviets and how to read them, the different fronts. Remember, the Voronezh front is the light orange, and then the red is the southwest front. Breaks down all the different counters there for you, which we've already seen. Then we have setting up for play, starts on page 7. Then we get into the sequence of play, breaks down all the steps for the sequence of play, the German draw pile and commands. Then how to play cards from your hand, the activation commands, replacement commands, activating German units and formations. Then we have illustrated examples. Just like we saw with the 2-player game, there's going to be a lot of illustrated examples to help you understand the different aspects of the game. Here we have examples for the German Corps activation by Army card and activating a German Kampfgruppe. And we have the German consecutive activation restriction, German reserves, deploying your German reserves, multi-unit deployments, delayed reserves, and at the top right we have the illustrated example for deploying German reserves. Then the Soviet draw pile and commands, an illustrated example for the Soviet front card activation, because remember we talked about it already a couple times, the fronts that the Soviets are going to have. Just like you've got the subordinate units for the Germans, you're going to have the same for the Soviets, and that's all going to be based on front, which is color-coded. Same for the Germans. And we have the Soviet unit activations, Soviet front and army objectives, reaching a front's 3rd objective, Soviet movement methods, adjacent to German victory point hex and near objectives, open supply line, movement methods 4 through 9, and Soviet spearheads. Then we have the illustrated example here for processing movement methods for the 3rd Tank Army on game turn 1. Then you have your Soviet VP hex, adjacent to German VP hex, relieving garrisons, moving closest to the front objectives. Another illustrated example here for processing movement methods for Mobile Group Popov in game turn 3. Bottom right here, we've got processing movement methods for the 6th Army on game turn 8. And we have avoid surround, adjacent to German victory point hacks, cause surround, all these different steps here. We're not going to go into great detail on this because this is a long rule book. We still have to look at the Soviet solo rules. Soviet attack checks, more illustrated examples. Like every page has illustrated examples, which is fantastic and reinforcing how to understand the game. Zones of control. Then we get to combat here on page 30. More illustrated examples on how to handle combat for both the AI as well as for yourself. Processing your hits, Soviet attack or hit reduction, all the things that we've already seen in the 2-player game. Advance after combat. Example of German retreats. Examples of German advance after combat. 2 hex advance, supply. And then we have an example of tracing supply. Example of Soviet support. Town, cities, and improved positions. Soviet garrisons, replacements. Then we get to victory conditions, and finally the scenarios. Same as we saw with 2-player game, it's going to be the same across the board. You have 3 scenarios: the initial assault, Operation Star and Gallop, and then the campaign game. And that's why they recommend you play the 2-player game first so you understand the base mechanics, the flow of the game, how it all works. That way you can jump into this and work on just understanding how the solitary AI works as well as how you're going to fight it as either the Soviets or the Germans. Then we have the setup adjustment diagrams, the town and city gazetteer, Then we finish out with the back of the rulebook with the sequence of play summary. And lastly, we'll take a look at the Soviet solo rules. This is a 44-page full-color rulebook. Same as you saw at the other ones. Inside of the front cover with the table of contents, listing out all the rules, associated page numbers, our introduction explaining all the components. For the first few pages, setting up for play on page 7. So it's going to follow a very similar format, just stating the differences between the German and the Soviet side when it comes to solitaire. Soviet draw pile and commands, activating Soviet units and formations, Soviet reserves, German draw pile and commands. Same thing we saw with the German, just going to be flipped here for the German player versus the Soviets, the AI from the other rulebook. German activations, actions, and action cards. Plenty of illustrated examples sprinkled throughout. Checking an action card, movement adjacent to Soviet units. Then we have the examples of German action card checks. Illustration of movement. Soviet front boundaries and zones of control. Soviet withdrawal. Then we have combat on page 27. Breakdown of all the steps for combat, just like we've seen in the other two rule books. Just giving you the AI specific steps for the Germans as you play the Soviet player in this rulebook. Get into supply, tracing supply. Looks like it's going to be pretty much the same illustrated examples that you saw in the other rulebooks, probably just tailored for these situations. Then we get the town, cities, and improved positions, replacements, and then victory conditions, the scenarios, which we've already looked at with the other two rules, and then we finish out the back of the rulebook again with the sequence of play summary. And that is a look at everything you get inside of Enemy Action Kharkov. This is a game designed by John Butterfield and published by Compass Games. Once again, you get a tremendous amount of game inside the box. Enemy Action Ardennes had the same thing. You had the Allied Solitaire, you had the German Solitaire, you had the two-player game. Enemy Action Kharkov, you get the two-player, the German solo, and the Soviet solo. An amazing amount of game inside of one box. 3 full games inside one box. That's why the price tag is not low. You're getting 3 full games. And it is something that you saw with the two-player rules. It does not seem like it's a difficult game for most war gamers to grasp. It gets more complex when you get into the solitaire AI stuff, because you got to deal with the AI, and then on top of working the AI, you've got to work your guys too. So when you play two sides, when you're playing two-player in your standard war game, it's not too bad to switch hats. But when you're dealing with an AI, that's when things get a little more complex. You saw the rules here were only 25 pages. It doubles up when you get to the solitaire rules, and that's because of the AI system that you're going to have to work. That's why they recommend starting off with two-player. Then you can work your way into the AI stuff, and you'll have a better understanding of the base game and how it works. And that way the AI stuff will be what you can concentrate on, being that you understand the mechanics of combat, movement, all that stuff. But beautifully done components. Really did a great job. Compass did an amazing job with this once again. Pre-round encounters, no clipping like we had to do with Enemy Action Ardennes, and Enemy Action Ardennes reprint is out right now as well. This is now on Kickstarter, so if you do not have this game already on order with Compass, and you're just coming up on this video for the first time and you want a really cool solitaire system as well as a two-player system, a great versatile system, this is the one to check out for sure. And you can get in on the Kickstarter for the next couple weeks. I think it's still up there for. And you can also buy add-on games. So definitely worth checking that out if you've not already done so. Well, I know everyone is really looking forward to getting this one on the table, as am I. Well, I hope that helps you guys out if you'd be curious about this one. If you have any comments or questions, post them down below. Thanks for tuning in, guys. See you next time.